Welcome to another edition of Application Security in Action. My name is Chris Miller, and today we'll explore yet another aspect of building a highly effective application security program. Buckle up. Having worked with dozens of Fortune 50 and multinational organizations to build or rebuild their application security program, I can categorically report that many struggled due to poor risk management practices within their programs. Application security scanning simply isn't enough. Yes, it does help to qualify and quantify your risk, but if you don't remediate, you've actually made it worse. You now know your situation and may incur organizational or even personal liability for failing to correct the flaws and vulnerabilities found through scanning. Today's video will provide best practices to overcome challenges in this area. Our learning objectives for this video include why aligned, efficient risk management practices are essential, goals and outcomes we are seeking from this practice area, and finally, best practice characteristics of an effective risk management practice. Now, please note that I will be producing several deep dive videos providing additional details on some of the topics you'll be learning about today. In the context of an application security program, ineffective risk management can manifest in many negative outcomes. These include the cost of processes or sub-processes exceeding the value of what they provide, bloated processes slowing the expedient delivery of new functions to keep the organization competitive or simply meeting the needs of your customers, an inability to scale to meet the needs of the business to deliver against the entire application portfolio, added friction or even animus between stakeholders, especially with development groups, misunderstanding of the total risk posture of the application layer, especially between stakeholders, including executive management, individual risk getting lost in the shuffle or simply lost over time, bypassing process for expedience under pressure, leading to repeated poor decision making, and ultimately leading to a risk posture ripe for compromise. The ultimate outcomes from the best practices discussed today are to increase the efficiency of individual processes and thereby reduce the costs of the associated processes. These factors will in turn enable working at scale while still meeting the risk tolerance goals of your organization. So let's talk about some key characteristics of an effective risk management program. First of all, your practice must be aligned to your organization's business needs. All of your process design must leverage cost-benefit principles in both construction and practice. Make exceptions exceptional. It is a complete waste of time and money to build an exception factory. Try to avoid over-reliance on compensating controls as factors in risk acceptance. Avoid resource throttling of remediation. Quantify your organization's risk tolerance and align your practices accordingly. Avoid building remediation-only development teams, as your other development teams will have no incentive to stop the introduction of new flaws into your environment. Enforce defined security gates in your SDLC. Acceptable is acceptable. Now translate the impact of your application security risk to your GRC and executives. They aren't the experts that you are, and you need to help them to equate the risk in terms they understand. Enforce strong separation of duty principles. And finally, dismiss second and third party risk is somehow different from the first party risk introduced within your proprietary code being written. Let's examine each of these in more detail. In Habit 3, I spoke about aligning your policy to your business needs. This alignment must also apply to your remediation and risk management practices. At the end of the day, all security requirements are business requirements. There is no technology for the sake of technology or bragging rights. So, do your practices and processes meet all of your business requirements, including delivering new software feature functionality at the velocity to remain competitive, maintaining revenue by avoiding the loss of reputation and trust in your marketplace, avoiding financial losses due to data breach or business disruption leading to a loss in profitability, or avoiding regulatory fines leading to a similar loss in profitability, All of these requirements must be clearly defined in practical and measurable form in your program charter, policies, and supporting documentation. Your actual remediation and risk management practices must in turn align to this government. See Habit 3 for additional detail. As in everything you do in the IT world, you want to apply cost-benefit principles in designing your processes. Don't overturn on this, and it doesn't always have to be mathematically sound. In general, the benefit to your organization should be more than the cost of executing the process. To start with, decompose policy statements and create rules to govern what is acceptable into your risk profiles. In other words, predetermine what conditions are acceptable or not acceptable from a risk perspective. This way, you're not having one-off conversations about risk acceptance for every flaw or vulnerability. Now, this is easy to say, but harder to do if you have not yet secured the sponsorship and established the governance to be able to stick to these rules. For your corner cases, establish a decision process that does not cost more than the labor to fix the flaw. Look, most flaws aren't going to cost more than about a half hour for a developer to correct. Therefore, any conversation between two people needs to be less than 15 minutes, or between three people, less than 10 minutes, and so on. Very probably, there are upcoming functional and regression test cycles where you can vet the fixes have not impacted your functionality. Don't fall into the trap of accepting false premises, of not having time to fix, being too expensive to fix, and so on, because it's probably not true. Now, I don't want to blow anybody's mind with a seemingly contrary position, but there is an exception to this general approach. And that is that we need to make the submission of request for exception a little bit more painful, time-consuming, onerous for the submitter than actually fixing the flaw. Human nature will naturally go to the easy button every single time. And if you make it too easy for the developer submitter to submit and gain an exception for fixing a flaw, you'll never get anyone to execute remediation for future security flaws. If you haven't already guessed where this is driving toward, you must make and keep exceptions exceptional. Your organization gains nothing by becoming an exception factory. Sure, you'll gain an understanding of your risk by scanning without fixing, but once the mentality that exception requests will usually be accepted takes hold, you'll rarely fix any issues in the future. Now, this doesn't mean zero inflexibility, but this is where you go back to the rules you've established for acceptable risk and sticking to them. Some key considerations of this will include: exceptions cannot be granted on a routine basis. If this is happening, you do not have alignment within your risk posture and the profiles you've created. This is not representing your true organizational risk tolerance. If it is fully acceptable to have an organizational conversation to adjust resourcing to allow for remediation, or adjusting your organizational policies to truly reflect more closely your organization's needs and making some consequence adjustments to your risk profiles. Now, don't let your C-suite off the hook in these adjustments. They are accountable and need to be part of these changes to your governance. Do not allow for grace periods. Out of compliance is out of compliance. Grace periods more often than not become an excuse to delay remediation activities, so don't feed this bad behavior. Lastly, do not make a distinction between old flaws and new flaws. Basically, hackers don't really care if the vulnerability has been there for 3 minutes or 3 years. They will exploit whatever opportunities that are present. And in fact, the older the flaw, the more information is out there on how to exploit it. Now, this may seem a little rigid, but it is critical to actually reducing your risk. It is extremely common for exceptions to be granted with the caveat that there are compensating controls. This is a narrative that started to be pressed many years back in vulnerability management under the guise that risks must be seen in context. While this is conceptually true, it does ignore the fact that all controls can be circumvented. The whole concept of application security is predicated on this fact. Security principles of defense in depth and zero trust architecture are well accepted and have been for many years. Reliance on compensating controls should only be for a very limited duration on the premise that the vulnerability will be remediated quickly rather than for a long-term risk acceptance strategy. One of the most common mistakes in a new program, or perhaps one that is resetting, is to designate a number of resources or hours to execute remediation. This is typically done by designating a percentage of hours within the existing development teams. While well-intentioned, it is neither practical nor sending the right message. The rate of remediation should be dictated by the gap between the actual risk and the acceptable risk. Setting a fixed labor pool oblivious to this gap is likely to set your program up for failure, and it will probably never close your gap. Another problem with this approach is it sends mixed messages. While we all know that resources are finite, you will dilute the concept of acceptable risk if you fix the resource spend irrespective of the actual gap. My recommendation is to close off the introduction of new flaws and drive remediation of the older flaws and vulnerabilities to a defined timeline. The timeline and amount of resources must be sized and adjusted as needed. Another common error is to provision remediation-only teams. This is often outsourced to presumably less expensive resources, but there are several real problems with this approach. First of all, if outsourced, the team is de facto less familiar with your code and probably less skilled than your core developers. You'll likely still expend your developers' hours as they act as subject matter experts to this outsourced crew. The resultant inefficiency will likely cancel any cost savings. Now, if you insource your remediation to remediation-only teams, your primary problem is that your development teams have no incentive to cease the introduction of new flaws, which will continually add risk to your organization. Now, this phenomenon also applies to the outsourced case. Now, if you ever want to step off the endless carousel of fixing only to constantly finding new flaws, you need to make your core developers accountable for fixing the flaws and avoiding the introduction of new flaws during your development lifecycle. Another best practice is to use automation to enforce compliance to defined policy requirements. In your CI/CD or DevSecOps automation, this is typically referred to as a security gate, and breaking the build where failure to pass requirements disallows the software to proceed to the next stage. Now, security gates can be inserted at various points and multiple points within your SDLC. It is really up to your needs, but at a minimum, there should be a gate prior to release to production. Of course, you need to be realistic. If you're just starting out your program or perhaps resetting it due to any number of factors, you cannot enforce gates right from a cold start. You'll need to achieve the desired compliance before you begin enforcement. Your developers, and more importantly, your business, won't tolerate the disruption of the delivery for desired features and functionality. Test to establish your security quality baseline. Set remediation goals and achieve them, and then put the enforcement of the gate going forward. The next best practice has to do with how information regarding state of risk is communicated to your GRC and executive stakeholders. As technical experts, it is sometimes easy for us to forget that our other stakeholders just don't have our knowledge, skills, and experience. They frankly don't know much about application security. This even includes your CISO, who may not have advanced up the ranks as you did. Consequently, you must abstract and translate the risk in terms that they understand. We could do a semester's worth of material on risk management principles and practice, but this is beyond the scope of today's video. Regardless of how your enterprise risk management works, suffice to say that due to the volume of flaws and vulnerabilities within application security, you cannot scale a process to evaluate each flaw or vulnerability in context. Similarly, you cannot rate the likelihood and impact in any way that you might have been taught or are currently practicing when communicating residual risk or the risk that an exception brings. You'll need to sell and get agreement on how to represent risk at this level. So let's start with the most easily understood concept. Is the in-production application or release candidate compliant to the acceptable level of risk as defined within the risk profile that's been applied? Until you have this well understood at the executive level, other metrics aren't all that meaningful. Another effective tactic is to represent data over time in relative proportions. In other words, is it better or worse than last week, this last month, some last period? And by what kind of proportion? Is it better by 10%, worse by 17%? Where's the current reality in relation to the accepted goals? Your executives may understand physical risk, economic risk, political risk, or even natural risk. But since they don't understand technical risk, it can be advantageous to equate the technical risk to the impacts and likelihood of these non-technical risks. Now, in order to do this, you must translate your application security risk into monetary terms. As previously noted, likelihood and other parts of the risk equation are a little tricky due to the lack of data. But where applicable by data classification for breach and confidentiality, you can use an agreed per record value, plus an estimation of any regulatory fine that might be applicable. These estimates provide a defensible value to compare to other risk types. For the impact to system outage, derive your estimates from your BCP-DR impact calculations. Perhaps settle on a day or 12 hours of outage to determine the cost of systems getting blasted and being made unavailable. Leverage these figures and from the sibling practice that will carry a lot of weight. Now, a compromise to integrity is the toughest to estimate in monetary terms. For non-money systems, you'd likely be restricted to outage and restoration costs, the same as availability. But for systems that move money, you'll need to establish assumptions and come to an agreed estimate for how much money is likely to be impacted. Take into account compensating controls in this particular case. Now, there isn't a magic bullet here. It takes work. Start with your most valuable systems and work your way down. Now, separation of duty is a concept derived from accounting that prevents single-party fraud. An example would be expenses and accounts payable. The expense submitter cannot approve nor cut the reimbursement check. The approver cannot submit an expense nor process payment. And similarly, the stakeholder that processes the payment cannot submit nor approve the expense. This separation of duty requires collusion between two or more parties in order to commit the fraud. Now, separation of duty is also a core security principle and is relevant to risk management. For risk management processes, envision 4 roles: developers, testers, risk evaluators, and risk acceptors. Developers are accountable for remediation. Additional testing will determine if code changes actually remediated the flaw identified. Developers can submit exception requests and make a case to temporarily or permanently accept the risk of the flaw or vulnerability found. Developers should never be the final evaluator of risk, nor allowed to approve risk acceptance. Well, let's take a moment to chat about false positives. What is a false positive? Well, a false positive is a test result that's faulty. It's not true, a mistake of the testing engine. The alternative is a true positive, which is you found something that was there. You can also have findings by omission, such as a false negative where the engine did not find the flaw or vulnerability that you know to be there from other sources, or the opposite, which is a true negative. Now, developers will challenge true positives based on several common factors. One might be that it's not relevant, either due to, as an example, a third-party library not using the particular function that's being called out, or perhaps business logic that would prevent exploitation. Another path is that the finding is not relevant due to mitigating factors. The application or other layers are protecting the function, and therefore it's not necessary to fix this. Now, it's important that you keep to language on here, because if these are being termed as false positives, it will be a problem within your program. So you really want to correct the usage before the developers spread a narrative of rampant false positives, which really calls into question and undermines the foundation of your program. It is crucial to nip this conversation in the bud for practical reasons. First of all, it will continue to waste energy because you'll have the conversation repeatedly. If acceptable, write a blank risk acceptance and move on. Understand that this may be abused and you'll have a confused picture of your risk posture. If not acceptable, have the reinforcing conversation and determine where your communication plan may need additional reinforcement to meet the expected outcomes. Now, testers may be humans or systems. In the case of humans, testers must have no stake in the results, good or bad. They are accountable for the integrity of the testing being complete and that it's accurate. This is known as the principle of complete mediation. In the case of systems, or usually combinations of systems, all components must have sufficient integrity to prevent circumventing these controls. Some examples may include developers should not have access to directly configure the testing, nor should they be able to configure the CI/CD or orchestration systems to manipulate potential bypasses to the testing and results controls. Another often abused point is code repositories, where developers can spawn copies or archive branches to avoid detection or simply push remediation requirements out. Common controls include access controls, where developers simply don't have permission to impact the integrity of these systems. A highly sophisticated example of this would be to cryptographically sign artifacts and match the signatures at points in the process to ensure that someone isn't substituting unacceptable code for prior or alternate clean versions of the software. As per human testers, it must also be designed for complete mediation. Risk evaluators determine if a finding is within the organizational risk tolerance as expressed through policies and other authoritative documents. Risk evaluators should have no skin in the game regarding the outcome of the evaluation. They are not accountable for holding back or expediting code release. They need to be an impartial party just relaying the facts. Risk acceptors have the decision-making authority to determine the acceptability of not remediating the finding or forcing remediation. It is difficult to place this role in the right hands. The decider must truly hold accountability for loss sustained should this vulnerability be exploited. If they don't, they will always press the easy button and allow the vulnerability to remain. The authority and accountability for this must be codified in the program charter, RACI, or application security policy. Similarly, the decider must have sufficient authority or influence over resourcing to actually allow for the fixing of the vulnerability, whether through funding additional resourcing, modifying the release time, or perhaps affecting the scope decisions that would cut maybe another deliverable to compensate for the time. The risk acceptor must be the business owner of the application in order to make an appropriate decision, including accountability for the loss should the vulnerability be exploited. Now, this is a lot to absorb, but it is critical to establish and reinforce the separation of duties and to anoint the right stakeholder with risk acceptance. Your program will fail if you allow your developers to decide on risk acceptance, as they will generally choose to accept the risk, but bear no accountability for the eventual exploits. If testers decide acceptability of risk, they will typically accept risk as they are avoiding spending time on painful conversations, and they don't really feel that they are core to the function. Information security, or GRC, would typically be the risk evaluators. If they hold the risk decisions, they will generally choose to deny the request in an abundance of caution, but bear no accountability for delivering business value. The challenges with getting the business owner to own accountability for risk acceptance are, first of all, a lack of technical knowledge, which will make them uneasy. There is an insufficient data to evaluate probability of the compromise. And flat out, most people just don't want to put their name on the line when consequences for bad decisions can personally land significant consequences upon them. Oh, we are almost there, so hang in there for just one more topic. The last thing I want to discuss in this lesson is third-party risk. But first we need to define what this is. In the realm of application layer security, third-party risk derives from the use of third-party components as either code snippets or entire functional libraries. We can essentially ignore code snippets, as these will be embedded in the first-party code, which we'll be testing and evaluating in that realm. But the use of third-party libraries is what we have to be thinking about. Now, the use of third-party libraries isn't inherently bad, as it allows developers to produce much more value in less time. And it will sometimes provide functionality that is difficult to write without functional errors or even introducing additional security flaws. But if third-party libraries are allowed, you must evaluate and manage within your overall risk process. There's a sibling concept I want to speak to, what I'm going to call second-party code. This is essentially functions proprietary and written by your organization, but perhaps written by another team than those that are using the library. This can be a great practice to ensure compliance to standards and speed delivery. But as with third-party libraries, second-party libraries must also be managed within your risk management practice. So let's talk some best practice, and we'll start with third-party libraries. You really have two different approaches with third-party libraries, centralized or decentralized management. In centralized management, a stakeholder or stakeholder group is appointed to curate third-party libraries. They introduce, vet, test, manage, and hold acceptable libraries in an approved and controlled repository. Developers can submit new libraries for consideration approval, but the third-party stakeholder will test libraries and deem acceptable or unacceptable according to formal policy. Only when tested and approved are developers allowed to use these libraries. The centralized stakeholder is also accountable to manage updates to libraries and remove unsecure versions as new secure versions become available. No part of this approach removes the need to test for vulnerabilities within your development lifecycle of your first-party code. In decentralized management, the developers themselves manage the third-party libraries. This is generally preferred by developers for speed and agility. However, this approach still requires testing and remediation when vulnerabilities are found, to the same extent as they would their first-party findings. In either case, you cannot allow for an argument of, I didn't build it to hold water. The developers using third-party libraries must ultimately be accountable for the overall security quality of their applications. Where a safe version of a library is not available, developers must either find a new library to meet their needs that is secure, or even potentially write functionality in first-party code. For second-party libraries, management of the libraries is definitionally centralized and must include its own lifecycle management, including secure testing. However, nothing is made by people is perfect. You do need a remediation workflow process to rapidly resolve findings from the apps using these common components. In today's video, we've talked about many best practices upon which you can build your risk management practice for application security. Practical alignment to the business needs is key. We also have to think of cost-benefit principles as we design our different processes. Overall, you need to make exceptions exceptional and avoid over-reliance on compensating controls. You want to avoid throttling resources for remediation and avoid building remediation-only development teams. You absolutely want to move quickly to the maturity point of enforcing defined security gates within your software development lifecycle. You need to translate the impact to your GRC and executive teams because they don't really understand AppSec like you do. You need to enforce strong separation of duty practices within all of the processes for risk management. And finally, treat second and third party risk as you would first party risks with the same level of drive and vigor that you do in your first party code. My name is Chris Miller. I hope you found this edition of Habits of Highly Successful Application Security Programs useful. Please like and subscribe to the channel to ensure that you don't miss new content. Have a great day and keep the bad guys away.